So my name is Charlie Kuchenbrod, and I'm joined tonight by my colleagues Lee Gagan, Mary Nelson, and David Cleaver Bartholomew. And we are really pleased that you are finding time this evening to join us. I'm going to share the slide deck. So you now should be seeing a title slide that says "A More Excellent Way." This program is part 2 of 4 parts. Part 1 was about faith foundations and moving from a mine to a how blessed am I mindset. Part 2 will be about inspiring generosity by changing our congregational culture from a focus on paying the bills to a focus on living the vision, living the love and justice of Jesus. I'm grateful for the work of Tiffany Vale and Drew Page for getting our stewardship content onto our website. If you go to this address, you will find the recording of part 1 and the slide deck, a bunch of resources, and a few testimonials from me that I hope will soon be joined by other testimonials. I'm also planning to post materials contributed by our congregations, for example, stewardship letters and other pledge campaigns materials. I have an excellent video from First Church of Christ Simsbury that should be up soon. There is a question and answer feature on this webinar. If you have questions, please use that. We will not see chat. I hope you are not seeing chat. We're not using that feature tonight. Before you enter a question, if you see a similar question, you can upvote that question, which will move it to the top of the list. We hope to be able to answer any and all questions that people have. Let me start with a brief recap of the first session. Stewardship program should be seen as part of a congregation's discipleship making efforts. Disciples are generous, and churches that strengthen discipleship will need less emphasis on pledge campaigns. People will support the congregation generously without prompting. The job of the stewardship committee is not to get people to give more money. It is to help people make faithful choices about how they use their money. It is a faith formation program. Most churches have a transactional approach to stewardship, and the more excellent way is a transformational approach. Now, I've gone through this recap very quickly because it is only a summary, and if you want more, you can play the recording of the first session. This was covered in the introduction. Tonight, we are going to shift the focus from individual transformation to congregational transformation. Our springboard is going to be a book about giving. Christianity teaches generosity, but American Christians as a group are not particularly generous. Now, some people have argued with me about this, but Christian Smith and Michael Emerson, lay out a compelling case in their book. I'm not going to restate the case here, but I will say it's my conviction that if your members were fully committed to living the love and justice of Jesus, that is to say, they were more faithful disciples, you would not be here worrying about how to inspire generosity. Smith and Emerson are academics and careful not to reach conclusion that the data does not fully support. They do offer some ideas to possibly explain this paradox, and I find that they don't need a lot of data to prove it to me, that their reasons, possible reasons resonate for me, and you can judge for yourself. One possible reason is that we live in a culture of mass consumerism. The premise is that we can have fulfilling lives through consumption. This is a powerful premise because there is some truth to it. 2 of my favorite illustrated books are Old Turtle and Old Turtle and the Broken Truth. If you have younger children or grandchildren and you don't know these books, head to Amazon or a library soon. A broken truth is an incomplete truth. It is true that consumption sometimes makes us happy. The rest of the truth is that purchased happiness is fleeting and mass consumerism inevitably leads to anxiety and insecurity as we keep comparing our consumption, our happiness purchasing efforts, to others. We only find fulfillment and security by investing in relationships and helping to build and live in a more compassionate, just, and peaceful world. Another possible reason for the paradox is that pastors are uncomfortable with money issues. My observation is that this is often true. Cliff Christopher, the author of several of our recommended books, suggests that pastors pretend they are back in seminary and write a paper, "This I believe about money and wealth." Then he suggests using the paper as a basis for preaching and teaching. Finally comes the hardest part. He says you need to align your actions with your beliefs. I know there are pastors who have not come to terms with the relationship between faith and money. One sign is when a pastor says it's hard to preach about stewardship because it feels to them like they are asking for money out of self-interest, or that they are uncomfortable dealing with people that make this claim. I think there are more broken truths behind these concerns. Another possible reason is that American Christians are uninformed or confused. My observation is that there are a lot of pew sitters, not to mention people sitting on the sidelines, who have unorthodox or watered down views of Christianity. Google moralistic therapeutic deism sometime, which is another concept that Christian Smith has come up with. And it's a set of commonly held beliefs among Christians, particularly younger Christians, but it does not add up to Christianity as more thoughtful people believe. I find it ironic that we are sometimes afraid to challenge these views, this watered down view of Christianity, fearing that we'll drive people away and that our sanctuaries will have even fewer people in the pews. When I think a better solution would be to be honest about the costs and joys of discipleship. Another possible reason for why Christianity teaches generosity and American Christians are not particularly generous might be institutional distrust. That people want to be generous and they're generous in other ways, but the church, there's barriers for them. I think that there have been too many examples of institutional malfeasance in our churches, and I think that all churches have been tainted by the scandals in the Roman Catholic Church. At a local level, church conflict often leads to distrust within the congregation. Another possible reason, views on what counts as virtuous giving. This includes the view that it is most virtuous to give when an appeal touches our heart and we immediately empty our wallet or write a check in response to this appeal that we resonate with. To people with this view, pledging seems sterile and not at all gratifying. There's certainly no endorphin rush in filling out a pledge card or making regular planned contributions the way there might be to an immediate response to an appeal. The problem with this view is it's not grounded in faith and allows people to feel good about relatively modest levels of giving. They should feel good about giving. They just shouldn't confuse episodic gifts and giving with discipleship. Maybe another broken truth here. The reasons keep coming. Concerns or secrecy about giving. My observation is that this is a relatively new aspect of congregational culture. In my church growing up, we didn't have this obsession with secrecy. I've been, robing up for choir since I was in 4th grade, and in the basement of the church I grew up in, there was a room with choir robes next to the kitchen, next to the counting room, where the counting was done after each service by the trustees. Well, trustees took turns counting, and people rotated on and off the trustees so that eventually many people served. And the typical way we did stewardship campaigns back then is that one Sunday after church, the men, and this was the 1960s, so it was the men, put on their hats and they went to visit people at home, because where else would people be at Sunday lunchtime except back at home? And they handed out and collected pledge cards. No envelopes required. Secrecy was just not part of the culture. There are ways to counter this now. In my church, the thank you notes for pledges are signed by the treasurer and the pastor, so that people know that the pastor knows. Mary's going to talk more about the pastors knowing about people's pledges in a bit. Now, here's the pivot chord for this presentation, as we're going to talk about a reason for the generosity paradox and also a possible response. So I'm going to describe two different paradigms or cultures that can exist in churches. And there are some parallels between the mine, and the how blessed am I paradigms that we spoke of in part one. The pay the bills paradigm is predominant in mainline American churches, and that is a possible reason for the paradox. The live the vision paradigm is what Jesus is calling the church to be, and a possible response to resolving the paradox. Spoiler alert, people that live the vision and churches that live the vision, people will be willing to give to be a part of creating the church that Jesus wants. So let me talk a little about these paradigms. Paying the bills, the focus is primarily on balancing the budget. That's an organizational goal and value. The focus is on serving the members of the congregation. There's concern about scarcity of resources, that more money for one program or opportunity means less money for something else, and spending more than we have will lead inevitably to deficits, and deficits are bad and to be avoided. In this paradigm, people often view the congregation as an end in itself. It is intrinsically important. The congregation has been around for hundreds of years and needs to continue to be around for hundreds of years. In contrast, the live the vision paradigm or culture is focused primarily on nurturing members' spiritual lives. The focus is on serving the world, not the members. Instead of being afraid that we are always going to run out or there won't be enough, we believe that there are unlimited opportunities to move ahead in faith, and that as we move ahead, we will be able to generate resources. We'll never have more than we need, but we will always find ways to have enough. And in this case, the congregation, it's not intrinsically valuable. The congregation exists as a foundation for widespread Christian faithfulness and ministry. It is not that the congregation itself is important, it's what the congregation enables or supports to happen. In the pay the bills culture, pastors are viewed as full service providers of spiritual goods. That is, the congregation hires the pastor to do the work for the congregation. We're concerned about members getting their felt needs met. That one of our objectives is we need to keep our members happy with their relationship with the church. It's a self-centered and pragmatic approach that we need to be independent, freestanding, capable, not relying on other people. And we need to make sure that we take care of the things that need to be taken care of. And a key in this culture or paradigm is what we really want is to have a really big show done really well on Sunday mornings. The Sunday morning worship is often the center of communal life. In the live the vision paradigm, pastors are seen as empowering and equipping so that the members of the church, the lay people, can do the ministry, can do the work. It's not about meeting the needs of people. It's about discipleship as transformation and challenging people to grow in faith. It's focused on others and stretching and growing as individuals and as a congregation. And the key is living out the beautiful way of Jesus in real time, living the love and justice of Jesus. I would argue that the pay the bills approach is very much embedded and comfortable in American culture, but that the live the vision culture is more faithful to the gospel and more Christian. Now, I'm always looking for validation. Skeptics would call this confirmation bias. Just read this though. This comes from Mark Tidsworth, who's the president of Pinnacle Associates, a consulting firm. And on our list of resources, their site and their newsletter is one of the resources that we've suggested. Once I learned about these paradigms, I saw a lot of connections from different sources that fit in. So I read a book about change that argued that most organizations are on the road to slow death, and that the only way to stay vital is to have radical transformation, deep change, or in our language, metanoia, repentance. I saw an article contrasting a transactional approach and mass consumerism to a transformational approach, which we have to label as countercultural. We will be fighting the prevailing culture. In the pay the bills culture, certainly a reflection of that self-centered and pragmatic viewpoint is autonomy is valued, that the church makes its own way, as opposed to interdependence, the reality that we are all connected and all dependent upon each other being more the value. A couple more contrasts: membership compared to discipleship. Attractional model. Attractional model, that's where we say if we could only rebuild our Sunday school and have a really good Sunday school program, families with young children would come back to the church, our sanctuary would be full again, our offering plates would be full, and everything would be fine. We just have to find the right programs that will attract people, as opposed to a missional approach, which is the church is not primarily focused on serving the need of members, but on undertaking a variety of missions and service to the world. Consumerist, we've already talked about, compared to deep relationships. Now, here is what I hope is kind of my mic drop moment. Are you ready? Ultimately, what the pay the bills paradigm does is that it turns church participation into just another leisure time option, while living the vision calls people into a life commitment to faithful living. Where we have turned church activities, including worship, into a leisure time option, we shouldn't be surprised to see decline. There are lots of leisure time options, and frankly, a lot of churches don't compete well in this arena. What we have to offer and have to offer is meaning and purpose, a life worth living, not a leisure time option. And we have to say that this requires commitment. Let's not lose the thread. We've been exploring the paradox of American Christianity. Jesus teaches generosity, but American Christians are not committed to the practice. We have moved from exploring possible explanations for the paradox to possible responses that will help people live in alignment with what Jesus taught. So if a possible explanation for the paradox is ignorance, we can respond with education. We need to talk about faith and money all the time, not just once in the fall or during a stewardship campaign. We need to be able to speak of faith and money in a confident, enthusiastic, matter-of-fact way. This is where work by pastors, if necessary, to make their peace come to terms with faith and money will help them be prepared to lead. And we have to acknowledge that the right relation to money is central in Christian life. And so it's got to be part of all of our faith formation programs, from our children to our youth and all the way up to our adults in the congregation. And if we're talking about education, we should also be teaching people about what Scripture says in terms of giving should be from the first fruits and proportional giving. And David will be talking more about this in a few minutes. Another possible way to go is testimony. If people distrust the institution, let's get some people to testify about how their lives have been changed by the church or about the positive impact the church is having. If people think that pledging is sterile, let's get some people to testify about the joy and fulfillment it brings to their lives. If there's a culture of secrecy about giving, let's get some people to testify about how they decide what they want to give and maybe even how much they give. You can never have too much testimony, and it is a powerful way to change the culture. Maybe some people need help learning to manage money. Before our anxiety about this idea paralyzes us, let me observe that people may really need help, and that teaching them will improve their economic situation, strengthen their marriage and family relationships, enhance their outlook on life, and enable them to be more generous. So I think that the idea of offering guidance in this area in New England congregational culture is challenging for some people. It's also challenging because many of the resources in this area are from our sisters and brothers with a more fundamentalist perspective on faith. But we are looking for and finding some other resources to help people manage money out of a faith orientation, and we'll be posting those on our website. One way to respond to institutional distrust is to emphasize outreach. More people are interested in saving the world than in saving the church, and there are many opportunities for testimony here. If we're going to counter the cultural perspectives about virtuous giving and secrecy about giving, or just about anything else that people have misguided notions about faith and money, we're going to have to create safe spaces. I'm surprised that, well, small groups is one way, and even couples. I've been the stewardship chair in my church, and I know that when trying to harvest the cards, that you have to know which spouse in the couple you need to approach to get the card returned. I'm also surprised to find out that many couples never really talk about pledging together, and it's one reason why pledges come in so slow. It's a reason why so many people keep at the same level from year to year, because they don't have to have a conversation to stay the same. Lee's going to talk about one way to create safe space to talk about faith and money. Before you go back to try to change the culture of your congregation, a word of warning. The culture will fight back, so don't underestimate the challenge. Name it and raise awareness, anticipate discomfort, stay rooted in faith, and locate your story in Scripture. Do we have any stories of transformation? Do we have any stories of wandering in the wilderness before finding our way? Just saying. And I also want to emphasize that culture is very powerful. The guru of nonprofit management, Peter Drucker, said something like, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So that organizations can't implement new strategies if it's inconsistent with their culture unless the culture changes. I really hope that this webinar will lead to discussion in your congregation. I hope some of you are having a virtual watch party and will be able immediately to launch into discussion. If you're not, you can use the recordings to play some or all of the webinar, and maybe you want to talk about these questions, such as where are we on the spectrum of cultures bounded by living the vision and paying the bills? Do we want to change this? How can we get to a more faithful place regarding generosity and stewardship? And I'm sure other questions have occurred to you as well. So that's the end of my presentation, and hopefully now you can see the rest of us. My colleagues are going to share some thoughts, and then we're going to move to questions and answers. Lee.
Thanks, Charlie. I appreciated that you highlighted the importance of living the vision versus paying the bills. If the ultimate end goal isn't money, then the path to get there shouldn't be asking for money either. If our goal truly is to help folks make faithful decisions and choices about money, it's essential, as you said, that we create safe spaces for people to share their thoughts. However, that's obviously much easier said than done. Tell me how you feel about money doesn't really cut it, and most likely will end in awkward silence. However, there are resources out there that can help us all to have productive conversations about faith and how people use their money. Tonight, I want to share with you one resource that I have found especially helpful, and that is the Money Autobiography. Often considered one of the most crucial steps in understanding both our feelings around money as well as our behavior towards money is taking time to reflect on the role of money throughout our lives. A money autobiography is a tool that allows us to do just that. It asks a series of questions that ultimately offer a deepened awareness of our own faith. So in my own work, I've found it to be especially useful when helping individuals understand their personal growth. However, this tool can be helpful looking at the growth of a church as well. So completing the Money Autobiography begins with a series of questions and prompts. They range from describe the role of money in your childhood and what is your happiest memory in connection with money, to do you tithe? If so, how do you really feel about it? Do you tithe because this is how you want your money used? Or do you tithe because you want to belong and you're willing to pay this cost of belonging? Obviously, there are no right or wrong answers, and the questions differ slightly depending on the resource you use. Some are faith-based and some are more secular. The two resources that you'll be receiving are both faith-based resources. But for the most part, they get you to think openly about the ways we earn, inherit, invest, spend, give, and waste our money. So that we can become more conscious and intentional about our choices. So once one has finished responding to these questions, the next step is to use those answers to think more broadly about one's relationship with money. For myself, I found that trying to think more chronologically and focus on the different stages of my life has been a really useful way to frame things. But ultimately, it's not about the writing. It's really about what you learn about yourself. The outcome is not only a deeper understanding of one's relationship with money, but more importantly, it offers some insight into our faith as a whole. So then the final step in this process would be sharing your money autobiography. So whether it's one-on-one or, as Charlie mentioned, perhaps with a couple or in a small trusted group, the sharing process offers a special opportunity for growth. And it's also that safe space for addressing feelings at a deeper level that wouldn't otherwise be possible. So I encourage each one of you to take some time and try writing your own money autobiography. I think you'll agree with me that this is a very valuable resource for anyone whose role is talking about money and faith. So as I said, I've shared these resources and you should be getting them following tonight's webinar.
Thank you, Lee. I actually attended a program at my church where we worked on this and broke out into small groups. And we say that people are uncomfortable talking about money, but I can testify that if you ask people to think about how your parents differed in their relationship to money and how your relationship to money is more like one parent or another, people will talk about that.
Yep.
You know, and it'll open up a conversation that then can go to other places. But it is kind of an icebreaker and a door opener.
Absolutely.
Mary, you're muted.
Well, I would like to thank Suzanne Smith, who typed into the comments the perfect question to set up what I was planning and to talk about anyway. Suzanne asks, what do you suggest for a church that has historically limited access to who gives to the collector only? This limits our ability to have personal conversations about giving. Suzanne, my plan for this evening was to talk about the question of whether or not the pastor should know who gives, how much they give. And I appreciate that you are asking an open-ended question that potentially could be more than just the pastor knowing. But I've met with a number of churches who have said, you know, oh, the pastor can't know. The pastor has never known. This is our tradition that the pastor shouldn't know. And my first response to that is, well, how's that working out for you? If your pastor doesn't know, and here we are bringing you this common wisdom that the pastor should know, and you argue that it's not of value for the pastor to know, or that it is of value for the pastor not to know, what are we doing here? Because you've asked us for this advice. Yes, a pastor should know who gives at the very least. Ideally, to Suzanne's question, it would be more than just the pastor and the financial secretary. The stewardship committee might know. I understand that that's another step for congregations to make sometimes. So maybe we don't do that one right away, but eventually down the road, there should be a number of people who have that information, because stewardship is a team effort. It's not just the pastor's job. But I specifically am prepared to talk tonight about whether or not the pastor should know at all who gives, and whether or not the pastor should know how much people give. And I would say, yes, the pastor should know who gives, and yes, the pastor should know how much they give. And there are a number of reasons why I would argue that. And I'm not the only one. Cliff Christopher, the author of Not Your Parents' Offering Plate, and a number of other really good resources for stewardship, argues the same as well. In fact, Christopher calls it spiritual malpractice if the pastor does not have that information. And he argues that it's because, he calls it malpractice because it prevents the pastor from being able to do some really critical parts of their job. First of all, when we talk about living the vision and switching to that paradigm, how is the pastor supposed to help you live the vision and help you make that paradigm shift, which is a spiritual shift? How is the pastor supposed to do the work of guiding people spiritually if the pastor doesn't know who gives and who doesn't give? That's an important part of an individual's relationship with the church and their relationship with God. And the pastor cannot help shape that relationship and help guide that person spiritually if they don't have that information. Secondly, the pastor is a fundraiser. That may not be at the top of everyone's job descriptions, but it's certainly in there. The pastor sits in trustees meetings. The pastor helps to plan fundraisers that happen. Pastor should certainly know that they are happening and should show up and participate. So the pastor needs to know who else is giving. Also, the pastor needs to know who to thank. how do you know who to thank if you don't know who gives? But the number of times I've heard lay people express that they don't feel valued in their congregation, they don't see any sort of appreciation coming back to them for the work that they do and the devotion that they have to their congregation. It's such an easy thing to write a thank you note, but you can't write a thank you note if you don't know who to thank. So the pastor having the information about who pledges means that the pastor can thank that person. And the last thing that I want to lift up here is that the pastor is one of the key people who helps decide who should serve on a board or committee in the congregation. And it doesn't make sense to put people on the board of trustees or on the stewardship board who aren't giving. It makes sense to populate those committees with people who give, and preferably with people who give generously. So the pastor needs to have that information so that they can help advise on who should be on boards and committees. It doesn't make sense for your stewardship committee to be populated with people who don't give to the church, because they don't have a leg to stand on if they're going to be asking other people to be generous. You want the people who are inviting generosity to be people who are generous themselves. And the pastor needs to know that so that they can encourage those people to invite others into a life of generosity as well. And the last thing I want to lift up is the difference between secrecy and confidentiality, because as Charlie mentioned, we have this culture of secrecy that is, nobody should know, and the pastor shouldn't know. This is secret. This is between the giver and God. And in the United Church of Christ, we define confidentiality as the appropriate sharing of information bounded by who needs to know, what they need to know, and when they need to know it. Secrecy means don't tell anybody anything ever. But confidence, if you trust the people who are making decisions with your money, if you trust your pastor, and I hope that you can trust your pastor, that you feel you can trust your pastor, they should be able to understand how to share that information and how not to share that information. But they need to know that information so that they can do their jobs more effectively. I think a far more interesting question to ask, honestly, is whether or not the pastor should disclose what they give to the church. And this is a conversation that gets us into a much more sticky place. I have heard of clergy finding out that they are the largest giver to their congregation. And I actually know someone who quit after finding out that information. The pastor probably shouldn't be the largest giver to the church. But if the pastor knows who's giving what, I think it's an interesting question, and I'm going to kind of leave it hanging to invite you to think about whether or not you should know what your pastor gives, or if your pastor gives.
I think it is often common for pastors to be in the top 10 givers of their church. And I think that many congregants would be surprised to know that. And maybe that's reason enough that they should. I can also think of another important reason for the pastor to know about what people's giving levels are, because if there's a significant change in giving from one year to the next, that either it could indicate some significant event happened in that person's life that might be a pastoral concern, or it might signify some significant change in the person's relationship with the church, which could also be a concern of the pastor. So there are many good reasons. David, what do you got for us?
Okay, Charlie, if you could give me, I'm going to try to share my screen with folks so they can see what's going on here. Okay, scriptural basis. Okay, can people see what I've got up on the screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay. All right, I decided to write this out tonight. This first section is just the preliminary stuff that we went over last week. And all that is mostly to do with the fact that we have, let me see if I can get this, just a second, Charlie. Okay. All right. What we went over last week with stewardship is that there's part of that conversion experience that people need to have in the church is to remove the sense of idea that we own everything, that it is ours to do with what we want. Stewardship is countercultural in the sense that God is the true owner of all that is, including our very selves, and that we are stewards given as managers to care for God's resources. It is not up to us. And that's what is in that entire first paragraph with all those scriptural references in case you want to look them up. I'm not going to spend any time with them because we've been there before. Okay, secondly, I was supposed to look at scriptural basis for giving in the Old Testament, and I looked at, or giving in our scriptures, and I looked at tithing, which is part of an overall system. Now remember that Jesus was a Jew. He was a very good Jew, as a matter of fact. And central to his upbringing would have been the Torah, which are the first 5 books of Moses, or the first 5 books in our Bible, which consists of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are core to the upbringing that Jesus had. So that's where all of these scriptural references are taken from. Tithes were given from the first fruits, the firstborn if it was an animal, and were to be whole and complete. In other words, you were supposed to give the highest and the best of what you had, not the last or the least. And think of how we give gifts to people that we love, that we esteem, and or we want to favorably impress. We give them good gifts. We do not give them the last. In other words, and so by giving the first good, also by giving the first gift to God, you made sure that it happened. Life was very uncertain back then, and a lot of things could interrupt. And what giving the first fruits and first born to God as your tithe meant that you were giving God the best that you had, and that you were placing that at the very height or the center of your life, and everything else was to flow around that. There were 3 types of tithes that were given. There were celebration and thanksgiving tithes. There was a tithe to take care of the poor and the hungry. And there was also a tithe to support the clergy, because the clergy back then didn't have any rights to land, so they couldn't make their own livings. So the first one was to celebrate the way in which God had blessed people in their lives by giving them land, giving them family, giving them life itself. And for, as the community of Israel was concerned, for liberating them from slavery in Egypt. The tithe also to take care of the poor was a way of using what you had out of your abundance to give to those who did not have. It was a vehicle by which God's stewardship for all people, God's care for everyone, whether they were rich or poor, was taken care of, because the people would give out of their abundance. It would go into the temple, and then it would be redistributed to the poor who needed it. And then there was tithes to the clergy. What do we have for takeaways here? One is that tithes or giving to the church is a means of expressing thanks and gratitude for the many blessings of life, including food, land, family, security, the gift of life itself. All the worshiper has is due to the grace of God. Nothing is deserved nor accomplished solely by one's own strength. There's the prohibition from Deuteronomy that we mentioned last week. Indeed, an argument could be made for the opposite case. The worshiper does not deserve what he or she has. The Israelites were a stiff-necked people and the least among the nations. They were a poor, enslaved rabble, and yet God graced them by choosing them. Okay, and has given them land and everything else. It is a means for providing for the poor. Tithes were taken to the temple to be stored and redistributed to those who were in need. Tithes then were a means of accomplishing God's purpose or mission in the world, of taking care of all of God's children. Abundance was not the problem. Abundance is not the problem that we have today. It's distribution that is the problem. And I would say, look at Amos for that one. Tithing was proportional, 10% of one's possessions. In Deuteronomy 8:16, it also says, all should give as they are able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God that he has given you. Remember also the example, Jesus raises up the example of the poor widow in Mark chapter 12. And she is raised up and commended because she gave all that she had. In other words, she gave a small percentage, even though what she gave was not large in an absolute sense. It was only 2 small coins. But in comparison to the others who were giving out of their large sums of money. So now there's the question, oops, all right, I've got to close it up. The question about what I give is between me and God, well, yes and no. Think of in a way it is between you and your God, it is a reflection of your relationship, but think about your relationships with others, with a family, a spouse, or close friends. What you do with your money affects them. Okay, if we look at the Acts of the Apostles, in chapter 2 and chapter 4, we see that the community held things in common and gave to people who were in need in their group. We as a church are part of the body of Christ, and you see those references in 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12. What we do affects the other parts of the body, how the body can function, what the body can do. We in turn, what we return to God and God's service through the offering at the church reflects what the church can do, both internally and externally, how it can care for others, how it can carry out God's mission in the world, how it can proclaim the gospel and live the love and justice of Jesus out in the world. That is dependent upon how we give, and that's what we give affects how the church overall can do that. And then finally, I would say stewardship is first and foremost about God, and it is not about us. It is about what God has done, is doing, and wants to be done. It is about how God has come first to us in creation, the giving of our very lives, and in the gift of Jesus Christ. We are first receivers, not givers. And out of that receiving, we give in gratitude and we give generously. And it is out of our role as God's stewards, honored, respected, and trusted, and loved so very, very much, so as to be entrusted with the care of the world and all who are in it, that we use God's resources to achieve God's vision for the world and the kingdom of God that Jesus proclaimed and initiated. A kingdom of love, inclusion, acceptance, grace, forgiveness, justice, and equity. And then closing with a quote from John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, "It is not how much of my money I will give to God, but how much of God's money will I keep for myself?" Putting it in the proper perspective. And there, I'm done.
Amen to all that. Preach, brother. Okay. So, while you were talking about proportional giving, Linda commented that many congregants don't even realize that their pastor gives. And I think that's true. I have had conversations with people about this who were absolutely baffled. They're like, isn't the pastor just giving back a part of his salary to the church? You know, who would give back a piece of their salary? Which is to misunderstand the whole motivation for giving and the whole notion that it all comes from God and needs to be returned from God to God, as David was just speaking of. I'd love to, we have some time, a few minutes to respond to questions. I'd love to hear more questions from people. Please type away so that we have some inspiration to respond to you. Lee or Mary or David, you have any thoughts that you want to add?
Let me just add one thing with regard to that 10%, that tithing piece. And it came up in a conversation I had with the Hampshire Association last week. And it is also addressed in the book that we just finished, Not Your Parents' Offering Plate, with a number of other nonprofit organizations that are out there competing for our funds. And Tony Robinson, in his book on stewardship through the UCC resources, suggests what he calls a modern tithe, or what somebody calls a modern tithe, and that is 5% goes to the church. And then 5% is allowed for the ways in which God might work through other organizations to accomplish love and justice and things like that. Because I've gotten the question frequently, does tithing mean 10% to the church? And then what about all these other organizations like the Cancer Society, and for those of us who love animals, the Humane Society, all those other things. But Tony Robinson adds that as a new wrinkle, perhaps, as to think of a modern tithe where a large 5%, at least half, goes to the church, and then it allows the other half to go to other
Yep.
organizations that are doing God's work in the world.
Tony Robinson has a great riff about potato chips for God, which is, God gave you a potato. Good news, he only wants 10%. This is a little, piece of it. But what do we give? The tiny sliver, the potato chip. Lee, you had something you wanted to say.
I was just going to say, Cheryl had asked a question and I answered I typed out my answer and I maybe thought it would be helpful to answer it aloud. She asked if we had any tips on how to encourage the younger generation, so 20 to 40 or so, to pledge instead of just putting money in the collection plate occasionally. And my answer was to stress participation and, set a goal. We want full participation. It doesn't matter the amount, because oftentimes people shy away from making that pledge because they think that the amount that they will give won't make such a difference compared to the person next to them who they assume is giving a larger amount. So encourage full participation. That's something that we recently did with our staff when we did the RIP medical debt appeal. Knowing that folks can give all different amounts, we said, don't worry about the amount. This one, we really just want full participation. And eventually, those gifts and pledges can become higher, but at least you get those people on as somebody making a pledge.
For churches to succeed, they need to be vital. They have to be spirit-filled, and they have to be viable. They have to have the resources, money, but also volunteer time and the talents of people to keep the enterprise going. If you do not have vitality, it is almost impossible to have viability. So you do have to ask yourself, if people are apathetic or not inspired, what do we need to do that will engage people? We do know a few churches that are not spiritually vital, but because they have very large endowments, they can continue essentially forever because of the size of the endowments. That's an interesting situation about whether that is the most pleasing thing to God to do with the money. But that's the only exception to the rule that you have to be vital to be viable.
I would also question whether that is a worthwhile expectation anymore. In other words, pledging connotes a certain degree of stability. And I know a lot of younger people, millennials particularly, and Gen Z at this point, who are fine with giving to the church if they're inspired, but their life is in such a state of flux that they are not going to pledge because they can't fulfill that promise. And so I'm wondering whether the drive to have people pledge is something that is more offered by people who are in a more stable situation and is a hearkening back to an older way of doing things, much like we used to think about membership as something that we paid a whole lot of attention to. Well, people don't join things anymore. Joining has fallen out of favor. People participate. So we've started to look at Sunday morning worship, and we've started to look at how people are involved in the church at other points in time. And we don't look at membership so much. I understand the need for pledging for budgeting purposes, but I'm wondering whether that's really a realistic expectation to have people pledge at an age where their life is most of them is in such a state of turmoil, and they regard pledging so highly that they're not going to do it.
Well, we then can emphasize other opportunities.
Correct.
They can still certainly be regular givers. Also,
yes,
we should make people understand or let them know that a pledge is not a contract, it's not a legal obligation, it's a covenant. And so we should look at it as an intention. And all churches understand that when circumstances change, people may not be able to fulfill a pledge. In terms of getting people to ramp up, there's been a comment. it's very hard to get good numbers on this, but a typical member of a congregation in a mainline Protestant church seems to give between 1 and 2% of after-tax income to the church. So, I've suggested that our stewardship goal should be to move people to 3%, because that would be, a 50 to 100% increase in giving. And man, wouldn't we have fun with all the things we could do with the mission and ministry if we had a 50 or 100% increase in pledging, and that would still only be 3% of after-tax income for people. My wife and I are tithers. We made that decision early on in our marriage, and it took us several years to build up to that as we paid off student debts, as we were able to move ahead in our careers. But it was something that was important to us, and you have to take that intention into account when you make large life choices like buying houses and cars and in order to get to that place. That's an illustration of the first fruits principle. But you can get there. And I also want to, I've got a video testimony up on our site. My wife and I have never viewed our giving as sacrificial, partly because it comes out of a place of abundance, but more importantly, because we have felt blessed in return. Not that God has directly intervened into our lives to reward us, but the way we interact with the world has been changed in a way that is reflected back at us in a way that we feel blessed. And so it's very important for people to think about giving. And one way you can do that, there's many stewardship ideas, and we're talking about preparing the soil, so to speak. Ask people to increase their pledge, to significantly just during Lent, and see how it feels. And you know what? A lot of people say that felt pretty good. Another advantage, younger people, when they pledge, are more likely to give electronically and set up automatic deductions from their accounts. And that also enables people to increase their pledge over time because it comes out automatically. That's a live illustration of first fruits. They've already decided to give this, and so they organize their lives around what remains. And so that can help inspire giving. We are coming up on 8 o'clock, and we want to honor people's time. Mary, you have anything else to add? I don't want to cheat.
Well, I was going to respond to Nina's question as well. How do each of you decide your personal pledges?
Okay.
I love that you asked that question because it's a challenge to us. As we are saying, it's really important that people talk about money in the church, and that pastors are equipped to help people talk about money, and pastors should know how much folks give. How do I decide my personal pledge? It's a matter of sitting down and figuring out what my priorities are. I am still in a place in my life where I'm still paying off student loans. So for me, getting to a place where I am tithing is still a goal that is a little bit far off. But this past year, I made a commitment to a seminary to join their board of trustees. And that is both a time commitment and a finance commitment. And my number one priority in terms of my giving is my local church. So I have made sure that my two largest gifts go to my local church and this seminary. The church is the most important institution in my life to which I want to give. So that's number one, is the number one recipient is going to be the church. I'm also very grateful to my undergraduate institution for the ways that it shaped my life. So that is the third recipient of my giving when it comes to figuring out what my priorities are. And I am working up towards tithing. So every year I sit down with my letter from the conference that says, this is how much we're going to be sending you over the course of the year. And I try to figure out what percentage of that and increase every year a little bit, as Linda suggested in the Q&A as well.
Mm-hmm.
Try to increase my giving a little bit every year.
Yeah, I'm sorry I overlooked Nina's question. I did talk about my wife and I are tithers, and so we tithe based on gross income. So we estimate income and then have to divide it up between the church and other charities, and we do roughly half and half as a modern tithe. David or Lee, would you also quickly like to talk about how you decide?
Oh, I think I'm right in line with the two of you, is that Dina and I both tithe. We had to make a commitment to doing that, and it was something that we did on an incremental basis because we had student loans to pay off. And we were raising two kids at the same time, and only one of us was employed because Dina was a work-at-home mom. So it took some time, but we did it incrementally. It's a commitment. It really is. You just have to say, this is what it's going to be. And then you let the rest of your life flow around that. And that's what you do. And so we give at least, we say, okay, this is what our income's going to be. And that gives us this much money to throw around and to primarily give to our church, but we also give to a couple of other different places. And I wish I could claim my two daughters still as dependents, but that doesn't.
We're running out of time, so I apologize for cutting you off, David. I want to give Lee a chance to answer the question.
I would just echo what you've all said. We sit down and really make a commitment to what we want to do in the year going forward. And every year we try to build on that. We're in a place where we have two young kids and student loans as well. So we aren't quite where we want to be yet, but we have goals for ourselves.
I agree with Brian Lapis, his comment about some approaches getting tired. I feel very strongly that when people say, you know, I give time, I don't need to give money. No, God wants all of it. You know, and so you can't exchange one for the other. You can't give money and not volunteer time. You can't volunteer time and not give money. And we understand people's circumstances will change and that they're in different places in life. If your congregation is not well off, there was a comment about lower incomes. You can still have a vital and viable congregation in any community. I observed last time, I think, that proportionally lower income people are often more generous than those of us who are blessed with more resources. Time does not permit us to dig further into that, but I'll hold on to that thought for a future session. I want to thank you all so very much for spending time with us this evening. We will have two more sessions. Next week, we're going to talk about the best practices and what we can learn from the nonprofit world, and also a little bit about the roles of clergy and lay people in stewardship ministries and churches. Our fourth session will be on planned giving. Thank you so much for being with us. We hope this is beneficial. We'll be posting the video and the slide deck on our website soon, and I hope to see you next week. Thanks so much for being here. Good night.